Number 10. Not so friendly fire. What happens when you mix an Ottoman invasion, alcohol, and gunpowder? I'm not sure, but I imagine it's pretty bad. Just like the Battle of Karansbees, where embarrassingly enough the Austrian army fired upon itself. Now, looking up military history will tell you that friendly fire incidents are more common than you might think. I'm looking at you, Vietnam War, but this incident is a little more unique as it may have started over a bottle of booze. A group of soldiers procured some alcohol and was enjoying the joys of liquid courage. After getting too boisterous, more Austrians wanted to join in. Not wanting to share their boozy finds and feelings, a fight broke out. The Austrian army was composed of multiple nations, so there were a few different languages being spoken, and by that I mean a very confusing fight broke out. Eventually someone fired a shot, someone shouted Turks, and a very embarrassing battle ensued. By the end, it's speculated that 10,000 Austrians were unalived during this boozy mistake. Hey, happens. Mistakes are made, happens. Number 9. History's second favorite mustache. When we talk about history, it's really hard not to talk about Germany and a little man with a weird mustache. World War II is the cause and effect for a lot of reasons and things today. That too could honestly be its own video, but what's rather uncommon to talk about in history's classrooms is history's second favorite mustache man, rhymes with Joseph Stalin. The battles between Germany and the Soviet Union during World War II were some of the worst, Stalingrad having the most casualties than any other battle during the war. The Soviet Union would fight back its invaders, but when they were pushing into the heart of Germany, it wasn't so much as liberating as oppressing. The comrade-in-chief is known for targeting ethnic groups with starvation and having a tight grip on the Soviet people by threatening them with gulags, harsh and brutal labor camps where anyone who opposed his regime would be worked to death in conditions that harsh and brutal simply don't cover. Historians believe his regime was responsible for the deaths of 20 million people, which is almost double the amount of his German doppelganger. Not cool. Number 8. Abandoned by the world. 1930s Germany wasn't a great place to be if you were Jewish. Matter of fact, anywhere near Germany was a bad time for Jewish people. Some people saw the writing on the wall and it was clear. Anyone lighting a menorah during the holiday season needed to leave Europe and set sail for more liberal waters. In 1939, a vessel called the St. Louis arrived in North American waters, searching for freedom and to escape persecution. Persecution that would likely lead to their deaths. This is an unfortunate black spot in Western democracies. As for the weary travelers, finding someone who would take them in was proving difficult. They tried Cuba, but were refused all but a handful. Then the US, same thing happened. They even tried glorious Canada, where they too refused them. Canada, a country of freedom and acceptance for all, turned down people in their darkest hour. Sadly, the boat returned to Europe where they met the same fate as other Jews who were oppressed by the regime. Number 7. Civil rights. I know a lot of these are World War II related, but bear with me guys. It had a lot of uncomfortable moments. Some that should be talked about. Acknowledging and apologizing for mistakes of the past is a sure way to have a brighter future. During World War II, there was something called the Germany First policy, meaning a lot of effort was made to defeat Germany first, but Imperial Japan was just as much as a threat. Apparently so much so that President Roosevelt wanted to put Japanese Americans in something called relocation camps. Thousands of Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians, cause oh yeah, we did it too, were taken from their homes and relocated to camps in order to prevent a second Pearl Harbor. You don't need an HR manager to tell you what an egregious act this is against civil rights. While they were not like the camps found in Europe, it's yet another dark splotch on two countries who boast about their freedoms and democracy. The camps were closed shortly after the war had ended. Number 6. Moving forward together. European settlers were not very nice to Indian tribes. That's probably no surprise to anyone, but what might be unknown to some is Canada's treatment of First Nations peoples. More specifically, residential schools, a system supported by the church and Canadian government to indoctrinate and assimilate First Nations children into European North American culture. Children were forcibly taken from their homes and were forced to learn against their own beliefs, language, and were victims of crimes and physical harm. Sadly for First Nations, this was somewhat effective and did a good job displacing families. The last residential school closed in 1997, which for many is still too recent and a painful reminder of Canada's past. Furthering the horrors of the residential schools was the discovery of unmarked graves in 2021, where hundreds of Indigenous children's remains were found, showing that Canada has a long way to go. we can and will do better. Number 5, sticky situation. The molasses flood of 1919 sounds like a lot of sweet fun, but it was actually a horrific event, and not just for diabetics. It was uncomfortable for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 being that 21 people lost their lives in what must have been the most confusing thing ever to see. A rush of sticky molasses flooded the streets of Boston and caused a crazy amount of damage. Reason number 2 being, well, how this occurred in the first place. I'll give the folks at home a second to take a guess at how they think it happened. Ready? If you said workplace neglect, congratulations, you win bragging rights. Basically, it was FUBAR from the start. The large tank that held the sweet stuff wasn't built properly, wasn't properly inspected by professionals. No one really understood, I guess, that fermentation produces gas, which made an already unsafe tank more unsafe. And, well, there you go. Boom! An unholy sticky flood. Probably one of the biggest lessons in work safety history. And let's be honest, who wants to swim in molasses? You never get out of it. Number 4, broken arrow. The Cold War wasn't exactly cold, as nuclear weapons had the potential to make it hot. Too hot. So here's something to make everyone lose a little more sleep at night, because I know everyone at home is stress-free right now and gets a full 8 hours of sleep. Tonight when you lay your wee head to rest on count sheep, I want you to think about broken arrow. No, not actually a broken arrow, but the broken arrow incident or incidents, which, if you didn't know, is the code phrase for a nuclear device gun MIA. For example, on July 28th, a US aircraft from Dover Air Force Base, Delaware, was carrying 3 nuclear bombs over the Atlantic Ocean. The plane experienced a loss of power, and the crew jettisoned 2 nuclear bombs into the ocean. And they have never been recovered. Wow, that's great. There were at least another dozen broken arrow incidents from the 1950s until the end of the Cold War. Now, as bad as that sounds, I mean, it's pretty bad. These are our nukes we're talking about. At least America's lost bombs were recorded. Nobody really knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost during the Cold War. Gee, now I feel real swell and safe. Number 3, Ik bin ein Berliner. This may be old news to those of our older audience, but news to younger. And honestly, it's crazy that it even happened in the first place. So World War II ends, right? And the Allies are all super good friends, right? Wrong! Berlin basically gets split into 2, capitalist West and communist East. So the Cold War kicks off, a very strong disagreement on what political and economical structure is better. As it turns out, life was just better on the West. People in the East just didn't have access to certain things the West did. So people started bailing ship. I don't blame them. So much so that a wall was built dividing the 2. This may not sound like much, but it was huge. The Berlin Wall divided families, business, and put on the full display of failure that communism was. As JFK said, democracy is not perfect, but we've never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. And honestly, the guy's right. That's just kind of crazy. Number 2, can't beat 'em, join 'em. Japan was the new cool kid in school, and by that, I mean they were the most powerful force in Asia in the late 1930s. Japan rapidly adopted westernized ideas, structures, and the old habit of invading foreign nations, and wreaking absolute havoc when there. Specifically, Nanking in 1937. Some historians consider this to be the beginning of World War II, but it's debatable. What's not debatable is the uncomfortable way Imperial Japanese forces treated Chinese civilians. Japan was expanding during the early 20th century, and China was next on the schedule. I'm going to recommend you Google this one at home, as there is so much naughty stuff about Nanking in 1937 that I'd give the censors a headache just thinking about it. There's a really infamous photograph that you probably haven't seen, and it's 100% not safe for work. The invasion of China and incidents like that of Nanking still have sour relations between the 2 nations today. Number 1, the world is yours. Okay, so kind of a broad stroke here, but very fitting. I'm putting everything the British Empire did at the number 1 spot. I mean, come on, guys, it's the British Empire. Sure, it's no secret what they did, but there's so much to unpack here. It's a lot. Redcoats have been making things uncomfortable since the late 1600s. The American colonies and how they treated Indians, the occupation of actual India, and the opium wars in China, just to name a few. At its height, the British Empire had conquered 25% of the Earth's land surface. And like I always say, when you get that big, you gotta break a few eggs along the way to make your omelet.
Number 10, adhesive bras. Okay, we'll kick this list off with a sticky mess right off the hop. Back in 1949, Life magazine released an article that caught everybody's attention, obviously. May 16th, 1948, the article read, "For 5,000 years, clothes have been draped, tied, buttoned, pinned, and buckled on the human form." Now at this point, somebody walking by would go, "Oh, what's this about?" Then it continues, "This year, for the first time in history, they will be Glued on. Yes, what in the world? How? How is that possible? One newspaper, please. Let's do it. Inventor Charles Langs. He changed the game in 1949. He made bra cups that would stick to you with adhesive. He was the OG who did this. Now, it didn't feel too good. Didn't quite work right off the bat, as most things do. The special glue, this adhesive, was promised to leave behind no residue. It was promised to be painless, yet at the same time, stay glued on, even if you were to jump into a pool from 10 feet high. That was the sell. Yeah, sounds kind of impossible, right? It was. Number 9, facial expressions experiment. Okay, here's a wild one. We're gonna get dark right off the bat, immediately changing up the vibe. The facial expressions experiment was no good. Back in 1924, a psychologist with the University of Minnesota, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say, sounds a little bit silly. More specifically though, he wanted to see if everybody's expressions of emotions were the same. Does happiness look the same on everyone? Does sadness look the same? What about fear? What about shock? What about disgust or anger or even pain? Yeah, so he recruited some volunteers, didn't tell them all the details from campus, and then he painted the lines of their facial muscles black. He wanted to see how each muscle would move, even the slightest movements. He then exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions, and then compare the results to everyone else, which would look kind of creepy on a wall now that I'm talking about it. It gets worse when you find out what the stimuli actually contained. I guess this guy wanted big reactions because he included showing them adult films, he exposed them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles and dangerous animals, and of course he exposed them to horrible things that I can't even talk about here on YouTube. Yeah, you can only imagine back in the day what the he saw. It was horrible. Yeah, horrible, right? That's a sad face. Big sad face in that one. For 8, the Detroit Ice Fountain. Located in Washington Boulevard, the Detroit Ice Fountain was obviously such a hazard. We can never do this again. This is horrible. You'll never see this. It was a spectacle, of course, but it was a hazard nonetheless. Back in the early 1900s, a fountain was the talk of the town during colder months. The water jets would run all year long. For some reason, no one wanted to shut those off. They just let them go. So in turn, this fountain would freeze and pile up, and then freeze and pile up, and so on and Danforth. Now eventually it reached up to 60 feet tall, made of pure ice, right there on Washington Boulevard. It was a tourist attraction at that point. This was so dangerous. Yeah, shifting ice, dangling 60 feet above your loved one. What could go wrong? I can only imagine. Just tons of ice cracking all around you. Families would just gather around. It was horrible. The tradition has now moved to Bell Island, so you can safely observe ice trees instead. A little bit nicer, yeah. Just not in the middle of the street anymore. Please? Thank you. Number 7, spin doctors. Oh, this is amazing. Remember when you were a kid and you'd spin around with your friends and make yourself dizzy and be like, oh my god, it's great. Or I guess if you're just doing that now, it's cool too, sure. If you're a weird adult. It's all fun and games until somebody passes out or hits their head, right? That's why we don't do it often. Well, back in the mid-19th century, this was how medical experts would put you to sleep. Yeah, more specifically, this is how they used to treat schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. They would just spin them and then see what happens. There was a whirling chair and a whirling bed, so you can pick your fate, I guess. A whirling bed, you ever lay down after a night out and you feel like your bed's spinning? It was that times 1,000, pretty much. They would spin these poor patients around until they blacked out, and the goal was to literally shuffle the contents of their brain around. That was their medical advice. Yeah, I'm glad we don't do that anymore. Imagine going into the hospital and being like, yeah, I got hit in hockey, my head kind of hurts a bit, I don't know. They're like, oh, no problem. Just get on this zipper here and just spin around for a hot minute. See how you feel. Number 6, animal droppings. Hey, got a sore throat? No sweat. Dog will fix that. Animal droppings being used in history for medicinal practice will always be hilarious. But it checks out, right? You have to look at the facts. Makes a lot more sense than spinning a guy until he's unconscious, that's for sure. Ancient Egyptian doctors, they would use donkey, gazelle, fly, and dog droppings to ward off bad spirits. Microflora was often found in these droppings, so the consensus was that these properties could include antibiotic substances as well. So poop was used for medicinal purposes as well in history. In 1957, a microbiologist, Stanley Falco, he began instructing folk to eat their own poop for medical reasons, which we here on Bumblebee actually disagree with. Don't do that. I'll tell you what you can do though, subscribe. That's much nicer. That has better results than eating your own. We don't want that. Number 5, Reindeer pet. Okay, Olivia and I are talking about a dog, but a reindeer? Maybe. I'll try and convince her. June 1941, the Germans were attacking the Soviet Union. It was one of the biggest attacks in history, and Britain and US had to send weapons, supplies, anything really, just to keep them afloat. Just to keep them in the fight, okay? So they sent these supplies through the Arctic Circle, which was the only route. But of course, it was littered with U-boats. Now thankfully, the British HMS Trident was there to watch the waters, and in turn, the Soviets were able to fight on. So as a gift, as a thank you, the Soviets sent the captain of said Trident, the World War II submarine, they sent them a live reindeer. Here you go. Don't eat them, just enjoy them. Please, just enjoy the reindeer. The British had to accept because of course it was ill-mannered if they didn't. So yeah, they had to keep a 6-foot-tall, real-life, alive reindeer on a submarine. That's so stressful. She probably had a horrible time. Her name was Pollyanna, and they brought her on board through a torpedo tube. That was her little commute onto the thing. She was a crew member for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Talk about smell. That's gonna, PU. 6 weeks in there? Get out of here. She slept better than most, believe it or not. She shared a room in the captain's quarters. Again, imagine the smell. I'm just saying. Number 4, ice baths. We mentioned an ice fountain earlier, that was for sure a hazard, but let's talk about some old ice remedies. So if you saw somebody having an ice bath today, you wouldn't think anything of it, right? Maybe they just finished leg day and they're trying to reduce inflammation. Maybe they're trying to improve breathing, all that good stuff, you know? But back in the day, ice baths weren't just for athletes, right? They were meant for those who had rabies. Yeah, athletes and rabies, here you go, hop in. Rabies was of course a growing concern in Europe in the 1700s, so a treatment was to take 40 grains of ground liverwort, add some pepper, mix it up in milk, and then drink it, as well as having an ice bath. Both those things right there, we go. Do that 4 times a day and rabies should be gone. Historically, it didn't happen, but that's what they wanted to happen. That's like a fear factor challenge. That's one of the worst things I've ever heard. Liver milk and a nice bath? Horrible. Happy Sunday, I guess. Number 3, tapeworms. Back in the Victorian times, they really figured out the trick to weight loss. Nice. Was it watching what you eat, counting your steps, maybe getting a gym membership at ye old gym? No, it was way easier than all those combined. And you didn't even have to pull back on what you ate. How great is that? All you needed was a handy tapeworm. Yeah, a little tapeworm inside you all the time. You know those things that can kill you if you get one today? Yeah, that was their plan back in the Victorian days. The plan was, if you eat a tapeworm egg, it will later hatch in your stomach, and at that point you could just eat anything you wanted, because every time you ate, the tapeworm, he would also eat. So you could get your snack on while still rocking those Victorian skinny jeans, know what I'm saying? Tapeworm cyst pills or the Stairmaster? I don't know, take your bets. He's like, I'm hungry. Number 2, smoking solutions. All right, don't smoke, don't do that. Here at Bumblebee, we say don't smoke. Back in 1665, during a plague in London, you were told to smoke cigarettes because they were considered disinfectants. This is wrong. This is, again, don't smoke. Yeah, sore throat, no problem. I'm sure this pack of darts will help. Here you go. We mentioned before tobacco smoke enemas, which is hilarious, but this is just bad advice all around. Since mouth-to-mouth wasn't a thing until the 50s, if you were trying to save a drowning victim, you would ideally blow smoke in their face or their butts. Either way, don't do it, it's insane. And then cut to 1964, it turns out smoking is bad for us. Yeah, what? Who knew? Who would have thought? Yeah, it's pretty intense now. The photos on cigarette packages, they're haunting to look at. Number 1, ants, man. Okay, I'm totally gonna jinx myself for this, but I've never broken a bone or gotten stitches in my life. Knock on wood, knock on wood. Chris, have you? Bones or stitches?
Yeah, stitches, no.
Bone yes, stitches no. Okay. Comment down below. Bone yes, stitches no. That's gonna be a weird comment section, but I'm here for it. Many of my friends have gotten stitches in their life. It's obviously pretty common, so I figured I'd cap this list off going back to the origins of stitches because it sounds very painful and it's impressive. Going back to 3000 BC, once again, Egyptian literature, this is where you could find this. Stitches were first made from plants like hemp or cotton or animal tendons, animal arteries, you name it. Catgut was common. That was thread made out of sheep intestines. That's a fun one to get right there. It's probably smelly. One of the craziest ways, though, of closing a wound was by using ants. Real life ants, believe it or not. Leafcutter ants, or army ants, they would be held against the opening of your wound, and you'd wait down for it to bite. Now, once the ant bit, you would cut its head off so that the head of the ant was still stuck biting onto your wound, staying there ideally until the wound heals up. Yeah, imagine Ant-Man shows up to save the day and he just shows a pocket full of army ants. Not what I expected at all, but still helps me. Thank you so much, Ant-Man, you're the best. Please send somebody else next time. Awesome, this is so itchy.
At number 10, population. It's pretty messed up just how many slaves there were in ancient Rome. In their society, wealthy people owned dozens, if not hundreds of slaves to do their menial work. In ancient Rome, anyone could be sold into slavery. No matter your race or background, if you could work, you could be bought and sold. Historians believe that about 90% of the free people in Italy by the 1st century BCE had ancestors who were slaves. At one point, the Roman Senate debated having slaves wear uniforms to be able to distinguish them from the rest of society, but they ultimately decided against it when they realized just how many slaves there were. One ancient Roman politician once said, quote, "It was once proposed in the Senate that slaves should be distinguished from free people by their dress, but then it was realized how great a danger this would be if our slaves began to count us." End quote. They literally couldn't afford to let the slaves know how many other slaves there were, because if they would have known they outnumbered the other members of society, this could have led to a revolt. I mean, there were slave revolts regardless, but we will get to that later. At number 9, lifestyle. Ancient Roman slaves experienced different lifestyles and living conditions based on a number of factors, often linked to their occupations. Slaves who didn't have a specific skill or trade were often used in mines and agriculture, and those were the harshest conditions that they could have been subjected to. Oftentimes, they were literally worked to death, and since they didn't have any human rights in the eyes of the Romans, they were often overlooked and simply replaced. On the other hand, household slaves received more humane treatment. They were treated better by their masters, and sometimes they were able to get some money in order to buy their freedom. If they were able to buy their freedom, the slaves would become freedmen, which was a social class between slaves and free people. Before we continue discussing the hard lives of slaves in ancient Rome, make sure you guys smash that thumbs up button if you're thoroughly entertained so far, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, Spartacus. At one point, a group of Roman slaves revolted, and though they eventually lost their battle, they survived a pretty long time thanks to one famous slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave who escaped a gladiatorial training camp and recruited thousands of other slaves to fight for their freedom alongside him. For the slaves, Spartacus was their symbol of hope and their leader. This slave army was able to defy Roman authorities for 2 years with freedom in their sights, but unfortunately those dreams were crushed when Roman general Crassus crushed Spartacus and his army. After Spartacus was killed, the authorities came for the rest of the slaves in the army, and they were severely punished. 6,000 slaves who took part in the revolt were crucified, and this was almost a warning to the other slaves against trying to revolt again. Spartacus became a legend, but it wasn't enough to free the Roman slaves. At number 7, ownership. In ancient Rome, slavery and slave ownership was such a common practice that pretty much everyone owned slaves, regardless of social status. Even some of the poorest Roman citizens would own 1 or 2 slaves. Obviously, the more money you had back then, the more slaves you could afford. In Roman Egypt, the average artisan owned about 2 or 3 slaves each. Emperor Nero was known to have owned over 400 slaves who lived and worked in his home in the city, but his numbers are eclipsed by a wealthy Roman named Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, who according to historical records owned 4,166 slaves at the time of his death. That just gives you an idea of just how many people were sold into slavery in the first place. At number 6, freedom. Earlier I mentioned that Roman slaves had the chance to buy their freedom. It was a lengthy process, but this gave a lot of slaves hope for a better life. Things weren't always better after buying their freedom though, and many of them sold themselves back into slavery because things were tough. The process of buying your freedom as a slave was called manumission. This could be achieved in a number of ways. Slave master could grant their slave freedom as a reward for their service and loyalty. The slave could pay their master a sum of money to be freed, or sometimes a slave master could just find it convenient to let their slave go. Most slave masters who chose that last option to free their slave for their own benefit were merchants who needed someone to be able to sign contracts on their behalf, and since slaves weren't allowed to represent their masters from a legal standpoint, they would be freed, but would still work for their master. You also had to be over the age of 30 to buy your freedom, so if you were lucky to live that long, then there was hope of being freed, but with the average life expectancy in ancient Rome being about 28 years or so, and with the living conditions of many slaves, they would be lucky to get that opportunity. At number 5, demand. In ancient Rome, there was an incredibly high demand for slaves, but since there were so many slaves in Rome, there was always work for them. Oftentimes, times, people sold themselves or their children into slavery in order to pay off their debts, so when it came to being bought, that came pretty easy. Other than public office, slaves were used for almost every activity in ancient Rome. The most common slave trade was mining because workers were always in demand, mostly due to the high level of danger that came with the job, and the fact that many slaves were injured or died while working in the mines, and slave masters needed to keep replacing those who could no longer work. Domestic labor and farming were also high demand jobs for slaves back then. Back then, the logic behind using slave labor for these types of jobs was that, quote, free labor should be used in unhealthy places, end quote. Basically, they believed that it was better to have a slave pass away on the job than a free person because it would impact their business less. At number 4, procurement. The way that slaves were acquired in ancient Rome was pretty messed up, I will say. Typically, slaves were acquired through 4 different ways. They would be brought in as war captives, as victims of pirate raids, by trade, or by breeding. During the early expansion of the Roman Empire, many war captives were turned into slaves. The pirates from Sicilia, located in what is now modern-day Turkey, did business with the Romans and supplied them with a lot of their slaves. The pirates would bring their slaves to the island of Delos, which back then was considered to be the international center of slave trading. The slave trade was such a big deal back then that it has been recorded that on at least one occasion, 10,000 people were traded as slaves and shipped back to Italy in one day. This was a big business opportunity for a lot of people, but of course no one ever considered the lives of the people they were buying and selling. At number 3, fugitives. As you can imagine, life as a slave in ancient Rome, or at any period of time, wasn't easy. Living conditions were poor, it was dangerous, and no one should ever be treated like that or used for free labor. Many slaves have been known to escape, and obviously the same went for those in ancient Rome. Slaves running away from their masters was a common thing back then, and to deal with it, slave owners would hire professional slave catchers to hunt down, capture, and return the escaped slave back to their owner. For slave owners who wanted to take matters into their own hands, they would advertise rewards for those who could return their slaves, or they would just try and locate their slave themselves. Some slave owners had ways of preventing their slaves from getting away, like using collars with instructions on where to return the escaped slave, much like a dog collar, which is just dehumanizing. At number 2, revolts. In Roman times, slave revolts were pretty common. There have been a number of recorded slave revolts in Roman history. I mentioned the one that was led by Spartacus, but there's another pretty famous Roman slave revolt that was led by a man named Eunice. Eunice led a revolt that happened in Sicily from 135 to 132 BCE. It is said that Eunice believed himself to be a prophet and claimed to have several mystical visions. Eunice was able to persuade a number of other slaves to follow him when he performed a trick where sparks and flames came out of his mouth. They believed that he was magical, and so they followed him to try and fight back against the Roman forces. Unfortunately, they were defeated, but the example that they set is believed to have inspired yet another slave revolt in Sicily later in 104 to 103 BCE. And finally, at number 1, totally normal. Probably the most messed up thing about life as a Roman slave was just how normal slavery was in society. I mean, the Roman people were so invested in their slaves that they continuously tried to crush their revolts, and they tried everything in their power to keep them from escaping. Even the sheer number of slaves that were in their society just shows how important slavery was to them. Back then, slavery was just an unquestioned institution. For many, it was just a normal part of life, which is actually quite frightening when you think about it. There is no recorded history of Romans ever questioning slavery in their society, and all economic, legal, and social forces in Rome at this time worked hard to try and preserve slavery as part of their society. To the ancient Romans, slaves were seen as the direct opposite of free people, which they believed was a necessary balance that they needed in their society. They never completely got rid of slavery either. Though they did try and create new rules and laws to make life as a slave more bearable, they were still bought and sold into servitude and were seen as property and lesser people.
10. It's just a cold sore. The Victorian era is cool. The art, the fashion, and technology of the time, I think, are always fun to take a look at, especially since steampunk has its roots in the Victorian era, and who doesn't like steampunk? Come on, there's just a lot of cool steampunk stuff. And honestly, we haven't seen a lot of that in a long time. We need more. We need more. Something not so cool from that era, however, was what you could catch from another person should you decide to take up a bed with another person. Syphilis, yep, one heck of a disease. Funny enough, it was so common that it was making intimacy itself an unusual practice. People were scared, and honestly, maybe rightfully so. There's no cure, and if it progresses to its later stages back then, well, you'd go crazy. And then you'd end up being that guy that's always screaming in the streets. Every city has one. You know what I'm talking about. Number 9, the French letter. The issues of intimacy and its repercussions were becoming quite clear in the Victorian era. Something had to be done, as spending any amount of time in the brothels could have you shucking barnacles off your lower deck in the morning, if you know what I mean. Introducing the revolutionary new invention, prophylactics. For those that are college age, you might find it disturbing that these party favors weren't made of rubber or disposable. Yeah, hear me out. They were made of sheep's guts, and they had to be soaked first so they would become flexible. Because when you put these bad boys on, they had to be fastened on. It's not very good, not very attractive. Once the deed had been signed off on, the device was then washed and then hung up to dry like your dirty laundry. Once it was dry, it was placed in a small box for the next time. Because seeing your wife's ankles might make you feel a certain kind of way, and now you just have it ready to go. And number 8, the products of our sins. Having fun when the lights can be turned off is great. Who doesn't enjoy a little toe curling? Yeah? Except sometimes there's this crazy thing that can happen, where after 9 months, another human spawns in. Insane, right? I know. Well, back in the Victorian era, this phenomenon was happening, but only for married couples. As you have to be married, of course, or else a child would be born out of wedlock, which to people at the time was just the worst. Oh, I never. These stigmas were not favorable for women, as some preferred to avoid that kind of press by abandoning or straight up just unaliving their children. Horrible, just horrible times. Just another one of those good old wholesome times in history where we were treating women with the utmost respect and decency. Very nice. We were actually not very nice. Number 7, diet. Bedroom misconduct was becoming a huge issue. Refer to number 9 and 10. While women did get most of the blame because, well, you know, history, men did get some of the blame. The issue of intimacy for men could be described as barbaric primal sense. So how do we curb this? How do we stop men from acting on these caveman urges, ooga booga? Well, simple really. Men just have to stop eating certain foods, as it was thought at the time that food had a link to the misconduct, or rather, the overabundance of bedroom-related issues, including mustard, pepper, rich gravy, beer, wine, cider, and tobacco. And if you weren't paying attention, that's basically the diet of every man in Victorian times. Not sure how a jar of finely prepped mustard would get you flustered, but okay, sure. The beer makes sense though, you know, have a few beers, and even the mop leaning over the corner looks pretty lonely, and boy, that mop has lovely hair. Number 6, job market. Ladies of the evening, women of the night. Women who make beds go bump in the night. They were everywhere in Victorian London, a lot. It's partially related to some of the points I previously mentioned. Now, I'm not here to say it's necessarily a bad thing. Personally, I don't think it is. As they say, it's the oldest profession in the book, with an estimated 80,000 women working in the night by the late 1890s. You'd have to be crazy to miss that. I mean, they were literally everywhere. With numbers like that, there's something for everyone and in varying price ranges, as they can be found in brothels or townhomes set up by the wealthy men for their mistresses, pretty much anywhere trouble likes to spawn. Even some artists took advantage of this by living with the gorgeous girls of the evening, as going behind closed doors with one was debatable, but becoming friends? Now that's a social transgression. Becoming friend, how dare you befriend the people of the night? Number 5, Jolly Lad. When people think about certain magazines that depict lewd imagery, you probably only think of Playboy. The bunny imagery was good marketing, honestly, just smart. But what if I told you the Hefmeister wasn't the first to publish such a magazine, or imagery? Back in the Victorian era, there was some saucy imagery being produced. The government had outlawed such indecency, but this only made the lewd picture industry move underground, where naturally it flourished, especially in major cities. And if you knew where to go and how to ask for one, you could purchase something from the hidden menu. Kind of like when you go to McDonald's. Yeah, there's a hidden menu there too. Google it and see for yourself. I'd repeat what my favorite one is, but I would be in trouble from the YouTube gods. And I've been treading on thin ice this whole video, so Number 4, the first counterculture. The 1960s were a very important time for many different people. Black Americans were fighting for their rights, music went from holding hands to strawberry fields, if you know what I'm saying, and everything that your parents told you just kind of felt wrong. If you grew up then, you know what I mean. I know people like to make fun of hippies, but there was some good ideas there. Well, in 1890s England, they were sort of having the same thing happen. Obviously, not as strong as a push as it was in the 60s, but still. Basically, after all the oppression towards bedroom relations, people began to open up. Not literally, just open up thinking-wise. That's really gross, don't repeat that. There's only one way we all got here. Unless you're a test tube baby, of course. In that case, thank you for watching CT133576-2. To some historians, this makes sense. When you push and push for things to happen or ban, eventually people will push back, especially if it's something like bedroom time. Everybody likes a little bit of bedroom time. Valentine's Day wasn't too long ago. Remember that? It was good. It was fun. It was good fun. Number 3, Jack the Ripper. While the man's numbers don't compare to any of the other horrible people in history, he's unusual because of his brutality and the fact that he was never caught. Jack the Ripper was maybe the first modern serial unaliver. He haunted the streets of Victorian London and is responsible for claiming multiple women's lives, women of the evening to be exact, and they began to know the name Jack the Ripper. Now, we'll probably just have to show you pictures of Victorian London or maybe some B-roll of a shadowy figure because there ain't no way we can show the crime scenes. There's probably a dozen different theories on who done it. Some say it was multiple men using his name as an alias, some say it was Prince Albert, there's even some who suggest that he was a she, and which explains why women were so easy to go off with Jack. That actually kind of makes sense to me at least, and why no one really would be looking for a woman back then. Kind of makes sense. Anyway, be careful out there, ladies. Just be careful. Number 2, Queen Victoria. It seems old Blighty herself may have been a tad more promiscuous than you'd think a royal to be. Well, not with other men, but her husband, who in her diary claims to be the love of her life, which honestly is kind of sweet and romantic. That's nice. One thing that I find interesting, however, is that while lewd images were outlawed, the Queen may have commissioned a painting of herself that was quite risque for the time, to gift to her husband, of course. Hypocrisy much? I say lewd, but it was probably just in her loose-fitting clothes, with maybe like an ankle showing or something. Still, unusual behavior for the Queen. I'll remember that for next time, Blight. I'll remember that. Number 1, Prince Albert. If you've ever stepped foot into a tattoo parlor, then you might know where I'm going with this. Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, had some controversy circulating his name. One, because he shares a name with another Prince Albert who was speculated to be Jack the Ripper, but also because of a very unique piercing. Go ahead and take a guess where that piercing is. Yeah, I didn't think so. As a man, if your anatomy could be described by an internet comedian using moderately funny euphemisms, then the piercing would go through your German army helmet. That makes sense, right? The horror. The absolute horror. It's rumored that he had one of these piercings. Did he? I'm not sure. But if it means anything to you, Nicholas II had a tattoo, so it's not completely out of the realm of possibility.